There are some things that even the hardest men cannot look at. By the spring of 1945, General George Patton had seen almost everything a soldier could see. He had spent his life around violence. He had said more than once that he loved war. He had walked across battlefields covered with the dead and kept walking. And then, on the 12th of April 1945, in a quiet corner of central Germany, Patton stopped at the wall of a building, bent over, and was sick. He could not make himself step into the room in front of him. What was inside was not a battlefield. The men in that room had not died fighting. They had been starved, worked past the point of exhaustion, and murdered. Not soldiers, but ordinary people behind barbed wire in a place built for exactly that purpose. This is the story of the first Nazi concentration camp the American Army ever liberated, of what Patton's men found inside the wire, and of a decision the Supreme Allied commander made while standing in the middle of it. A decision that was aimed, in a way, at someone like you, watching this now, 80 years later. Before we go on, this is a hard history, told plainly and with respect for the people it happened to. If that's the kind of history you want kept alive, consider subscribing. By April 1945, the Second World War in Europe was almost won. Germany was collapsing inward from both directions, the Soviets driving from the east, the Western Allies pouring across the Rhine. Patton's Third Army was moving fast through the heart of the country, taking town after town against an enemy that was, in many places, simply coming apart. The men in those tank columns believed they understood what they were fighting. They had been told about the Nazi regime. They had heard rumors, passed along in newspapers, in briefings, in soldiers' talk, about camps where the Germans imprisoned and killed the people they had decided were enemies of the state: Jews, political prisoners, whole categories of human beings condemned for who they were. But hearing about a thing is not the same as standing in front of it. For most American soldiers, the camps were still an abstraction, a piece of distant news, maybe even an exaggeration, the kind of atrocity story that every war seems to produce. Few of them had seen one with their own eyes. Few of them truly believed in their gut that it could be as bad as the rumors said. That was about to change, because directly in the path of the advancing Third Army, near a small town called Gotha, sat a place the Nazis had given a code name, S3. The people who lived nearby knew it was there. Most of the world did not, and the Americans were about to walk straight into it, with nothing in their training and nothing they had been told that could have prepared them for what was waiting. On the 4th of April 1945, soldiers of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division, both part of Patton's Third Army, reached the place called Ohrdruf. They smelled it before they saw it. Veterans would say afterward that the odor reached them on the wind before the camp itself came into view, and that they knew, before they understood anything else, that something here was deeply and terribly wrong. What they found inside the wire did not look like war. There were bodies in the open, men dead on the ground where they had fallen or been left. The Germans had known the Americans were coming. In the days before, the SS had forced most of the prisoners out of the camp and driven them on foot toward another camp deeper inside Germany, a death march that many of them would not survive. And some of the prisoners too weak to walk, the ones left behind, had simply been shot where they lay, so they could not be found alive to tell what had happened in this place. The soldiers who came through that gate were combat veterans. They had seen men killed, they had buried friends, but this was something their training had given them no way to absorb. These were not soldiers who had died with weapons in their hands. They were skeletal, starved, unarmed, human beings who had been worked, beaten, and killed in an organized, deliberate, methodical way. And among the dead, the Americans also found a few of the living. A handful of prisoners had survived by hiding, and now they came out to meet men they could scarcely believe were real. For these survivors, the arrival of the Third Army was the line between death and life. For the Americans, it was the moment the war stopped being something they understood only with their heads and became something they would carry in their bodies for the rest of their lives. To understand what the Americans had walked into, you have to understand what Ohrdruf was and what it was for. Ohrdruf is not one of the names most people know. It was not Auschwitz, it was not Dachau, it was a subcamp, one piece of the vast system attached to the larger Buchenwald concentration camp about 30 miles away. The Nazis had built it only months earlier, in November 1944, very late in a war they were already losing. Its purpose was forced labor. The prisoners of Ohrdruf were being worked to dig tunnels and lay a railway for an underground military command center that the German leadership hoped to hide from Allied bombers. It was a project born of desperation, and it ran on a simple, monstrous logic that the people imprisoned there were not people at all, that they were disposable tools to be used until they died and then replaced by more. By the end of March 1945, more than 10,000 prisoners were held at Ohrdruf. They came from all across occupied Europe: Jews, marked for destruction for no reason other than being Jewish, Poles, Russians, political prisoners, men the regime had simply decided were enemies. They had been doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, students, fathers, sons. Now they were starved on rations calculated to keep them barely alive while they worked, beaten when they faltered, and killed when they could no longer be of use. This is the part that is hardest to hold in the mind, and the part that matters most. What happened at Ohrdruf was not the chaos of battle. It was not soldiers losing control in the heat of combat. It was deliberate. It was planned. It had paperwork and supply chains and a chain of command. The horror the Americans found there was not a breakdown of the system. It was the system, functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Murder, organized like a factory. And then, as the American tanks drew near, the people who ran that system tried to erase it. They marched the prisoners away. They shot those who could not move. They tried to burn and bury the proof of what they had done. An officer who met the arriving Americans put it plainly. They had tried to get rid of the evidence before the army came, and they simply had not had the time to finish. Word of what had been found began to climb the chain of command. It moved up past the division, past the corps, all the way to the very top, to the Supreme Allied Commander himself. And Dwight Eisenhower made a decision that, at first, might seem strange for a man running an entire war. He decided that he had to come and see it, in person, with his own eyes.
On the 12th of April, 1945, 8 days after the camp was taken, 3 of the most powerful men in the American military arrived at Ohrdruf together. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe, Omar Bradley, who commanded the Army group driving into Germany, and George Patton, whose Third Army had liberated the camp. 3 men who, between them, directed the lives of millions of soldiers. 3 men who had ordered operations that killed thousands. They were not strangers to death in any form. There is a small, bitter detail about that day. That very morning, before the visit, Patton had written a letter home to his wife. The war was nearly over, and he was, in his way, mourning it, admitting that he loved the excitement and the responsibility, and that peace was going to be hard on him. Hours later, he would stand in a place that was the absolute opposite of the war he thought he loved. Whatever Patton imagined hell to be, it did not prepare him for this. The generals were led through the camp by a survivor, a man who had lived inside this place and knew, step by step, what had been done in it. Consider what that walk must have been. A man who had been a prisoner here, now guiding the most senior commanders of the army that had freed him, showing them, one station at a time, the machinery built for his own murder. He showed them the gallows where prisoners had been hanged. Other survivors stepped forward and demonstrated, with their own thin bodies, the methods the guards had used to torture them. The generals were shown a pyre, a place where corpses had been burned, with charred remains still lying among the ashes. They were shown the dead who had not been burned, and in a shed, the Americans found a pile of bodies, roughly 30 men, dead of starvation, their corpses scattered with lime to mask the smell. It was at the door of that shed that George Patton stopped. This was a man who had built his entire identity around toughness. He carried ivory-handled pistols. He cultivated a reputation as the hardest, most aggressive general in the American army. He had said, openly, that he loved war, and he could not make himself walk into that room. He told the others he would be sick if he did. He had already been sick once that day, vomiting against the side of a building when the sights and the smell of the camp first overwhelmed him. There is something important in that detail, and it is not about Patton being weak. It is about scale. Patton had seen war at its very worst and held his composure. What he could not stomach was something different in kind. Not the violence of combat between armed men, but the cold, industrial killing of the helpless. His body rejected it before his mind could even begin to argue. And here is the question at the heart of this story. Patton looked away from that room.
He could not bear it, and no one should blame him for that. But Eisenhower did the opposite. The Supreme Commander walked through the entire camp, deliberately, forcing himself to look at everything: the bodies, the pyre, the shed Patton would not enter. He made himself take in the very worst of it. The question is, why? Eisenhower told us why, in his own words. Shortly after the visit, he sat down and sent a cable to General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff back in Washington, the man at the very top of the United States Army. In that message, Eisenhower tried to describe what he had seen and admitted that the things he had witnessed were beyond the power of words to capture. He noted plainly that there had been a room piled with dead men that George Patton would not even enter because Patton said it would make him ill. And then Eisenhower explained his own choice. He had made himself visit every part of that camp on purpose. He had forced himself to look, not because any part of him wanted to, but because he wanted to be a witness. Standing among the dead, he understood something that would prove painfully far-sighted. He knew that one day, after the war was over and the shock had faded, there would be people who would try to claim that none of this had really happened, that the camps were exaggerations, that the atrocities were nothing but wartime propaganda, invented to make the enemy look worse than he truly was. Eisenhower decided right there that he would not allow that lie to stand unanswered. If he saw it with his own eyes, then he could say for the rest of his life, with all the authority of the Supreme Allied Commander, "I was there. I walked through it. I saw it myself. It is real." But he did not stop at making himself a witness. He set out to make witnesses of as many others as he possibly could. He ordered American soldiers who were not needed on the front line to come and see the camp for themselves. He had a blunt conviction about it. People back home had wondered whether the American soldier really knew what he was fighting for. Now, Eisenhower believed, at the very least his men would know exactly what they had been fighting against. There was no abstraction left. The proof was lying on the ground in front of them. Then he went further still. He cabled Washington and asked that members of the United States Congress and the editors of major American newspapers be flown to Germany so that they too could stand inside these places and see them with their own eyes. He wanted the lawmakers who governed his country and the journalists who informed it to be permanently unable to say that they had not known. He wanted the evidence spread as widely as humanly possible, photographed, filmed, recorded by as many credible witnesses as could be assembled, while the camps still stood and while the dead were still there to be counted. Think about what that means. Here was a general in the middle of winning the largest war in human history, deliberately taking time to think decades ahead, to think about memory itself, about how easily the world forgets, about how willingly some people lie. He could not undo what had been done at Ohrdruf. Not one life could be given back, but he could make absolutely certain that it could never, ever be erased.
There was one more group that Eisenhower and Patton were determined would not be permitted to look away: the German civilians who lived nearby. Ohrdruf had not been hidden in some remote wilderness. It sat close to an ordinary German town. Its existence was no secret to the people in the area, and so the American commanders ordered the townspeople to come to the camp, to walk through it, to see for themselves what had been done in their own country, in their name, a short distance from their own homes, and they were made to help bury the dead. It was a deliberate decision, and it would be repeated at other camps in the weeks that followed. The reasoning was simple. No German living beside these places would be allowed the comfort of claiming ignorance afterward. The bodies were real. The camp was real. It had been here the whole time. For at least 2 people, that confrontation was more than they could bear. The mayor of the town and his wife were taken through the camp like the rest. The next morning, the 2 of them were found dead in their home. They had hanged themselves. We should be careful about what we make of that. It is not our place to hand down a final verdict on 2 people we cannot fully know. But the fact remains part of the record, that there were Germans for whom being forced, at last, to look directly at what their nation had done was a weight they could not go on living under. And that is the strange, heavy center of this whole episode. Ohrdruf was a place built to make people disappear, to use them up and erase them, to leave behind nothing but ash and lime and unmarked ground. And in the space of a few days in April 1945, the American Army turned it into the exact opposite, a place that everyone would be made to see. The soldiers,
the generals, the press, the Congress, the neighbors. As many human eyes as could be brought to bear, all of them turned toward the very thing the killers had worked so hard to hide. The men who built Ohrdruf wanted it forgotten. The men who liberated it decided that it would be remembered. That decision, made in grief and rage, standing among the dead, is the reason this story still exists to be told at all. Eisenhower's orders set something in motion that would outlast everyone involved. In the days and weeks that followed, photographers and film crews documented the camps in unflinching detail. The images that came out of Ohrdruf, and out of the places discovered after it, were published in newspapers and shown in cinemas around the world. Delegations of American lawmakers and editors did come, exactly as Eisenhower had asked, and they went home to report what they had seen. The record he wanted was built, piece by piece, just as he had intended it to be. And Ohrdruf, it turned out, was only the beginning. It was the first concentration camp the U.S. Army liberated, but in that same April, the discoveries came one after another. Buchenwald, the larger camp Ohrdruf had been attached to, was reached about a week later. Then Dora Mittelbau. Then, as the Allied armies pushed deeper into the dying Reich, the names that would become infamous, Dachau, Mauthausen, and others. Camp after camp, each one confirming what the last had revealed. This was not an isolated horror. It was a system, one that had stretched across an entire continent. The evidence gathered in those weeks, the photographs, the films, the first-hand testimony of soldiers and commanders and survivors alike, would not stay confined to the newspapers. It would go on to become part of the foundation of the Nuremberg trials, where the leaders of the Nazi regime were brought before an international court and confronted with the documented proof of what they had done. The act of witnessing that Eisenhower had insisted upon at Ohrdruf became, in part, the evidence of history's reckoning with them. And then there were the men who had simply been there, the ordinary American soldiers who walked through those gates with no warning of what was waiting on the other side. Many of them never spoke of it. Some carried it in silence for the rest of their lives, unable to find words for what they had seen, flinching at certain sounds and memories decades later. They had crossed an ocean to fight an army. They came home having seen something that permanently changed what they understood about human beings and about what one group of people can be brought to do to another.
80 years later, we can still see Ohrdruf. We can see it because of a choice made by men who were standing in the middle of it. The choice to record, to photograph, to bring witnesses, to refuse to let it quietly vanish. The footage exists. The photographs exist. The cables and the testimony exist. So when someone today claims that these things never happened, the answer was already prepared for them, back in April 1945, by a general who forced himself to look at what his toughest friend could not. That, in the end, is what this story is really about. Not only the horror of what was found at Ohrdruf, though that should never be softened or hurried past or set aside, but also the quieter act that came after it, the decision that the truth would be kept, on purpose, against the day that someone would try to deny it. Patton, the hardest soldier in the army, turned away from that one room because he was human, and there are things the human spirit simply recoils from. That is no failing in him, but Eisenhower's choice to look, and to make the world look with him, is a reminder of something worth holding on to. Some things have to be seen to be believed, and once they are seen, they leave behind an obligation to remember them accurately and to tell the truth about them, even when the truth is almost too heavy to speak. The prisoners of Ohrdruf were not numbers. They were people. Each of them had a name, a family, a life that was stolen from them. We cannot give back what was taken. The least we can do, the thing the liberators asked of everyone who would come after them, is to keep looking and to remember. If this is a history you believe is worth keeping alive and telling honestly, leave a thought below, not for the algorithm, but for the people this happened to.